Welcome to today's audio lesson. It is a journey special and we will be covering two chapters, Running Water by Rohinton Mystery and Angulimala by Michael Ondate. So these two units have interesting journeys involved and we shall be looking at Running Water first. So Miss Rohinton Mystery's Running Water, which was included in the collection Verse Journeys, documents his travel to Dharamsala. So here he writes the harrowing process in which he and the difficulties which he faced while traveling to Dharamshala. So he says he begins mentioning the rain, the heavy rain that he had to deal with as when he reached Dharamshala. He says in the beginning that when he reached Dharamshala, it was still raining. So we can assume here that he reaches Dharamshala while or during the monsoon season. So he says that when he reached the hotel, he was completely drenched from his head to toe. All of his belongings were completely soaked in water. The main purpose of his visit to Dharamshala, which he mentions later, was to drop by his uncle and aunt's house, his family who were living in Dharamshala for quite a long time, and he had been planning to visit them since a few years but could not make it. And but this summer he decided that he will visit them by any means. So he expresses at one point in the chapter that whatever the difficulty, he was ready to face it, even just to fulfill his childhood dream of visiting Dharamshala. So the travelogue begins with descriptions of his arrival in Dharamshala, which is a district of Himachal Pradesh. He takes lodging in a rundown hotel named which goes by the name Bhakt. He reaches the hotel with some difficulty, and the irony of this the whole thing was that the irony of the whole thing lied in the name of the hotel itself, because the hotel's name Bhaksu, it stood for running water. But when Mystery arrives at the hotel, he is informed that there is no water supply, and on top of that there is no electricity supply as well. So he is told by the desk clerk that electricity had been sabotaged, because and not only sabotaged, and the electricity workers were on strike. They were demanding something, and so they were on strike. Plus the water supply had been erratic because the pipelines carrying water were damaged and broken by the avalanches. So this happens, this is a usual occurrence during the monsoon season. And Mystery was in fact told, he was advised to avoid visiting Dharamshala during the monsoon season. But as I've already mentioned, he was intent on visiting Dharamshala this summer because it was a part of, we can say, a fulfillment of his childhood dream. What happened was that every year since his childhood, he would dream of visiting where his uncle and aunt lived, but then due to one reason or the other, he could not visit the place. As an adult, he took a longer journey. He says this situation made him feel somewhat, we can say, it made him feel guilty that he could not visit the place which was so near home, but he had settled in Canada, which was much more far. And therefore, he decides that he will be visiting Dharamshala this time, and there was nothing stopping him in doing that. We see that when in the beginning of the chapter, the desk clerk informs him about one problem after another, and Mystery. He was as he was traveling to Dharamshala, the journey itself was very harrowing. He recounts his journey, saying that he started from Pathankot. He took a 28 hours train, a first class train, which brought him to Chakki Bank in Punjab. And even there, since it was monsoon, it was raining heavily. So that was difficult in itself. But then again, the other half of the journey as well was equally difficult, or we can say even more difficult. So we can say that this through this piece, Mystery describes, the challenges of traveling. Of course, there is the charm of traveling, as in the sense of adventure, but he also outlines the hardships of traveling. What he does after his what he does is that after his arrival in the hotel, he tries to make the best of his situation. He spreads all of his wet items um, all over the room, all over the hotel room where he is lodging, and feels a little regret for not heeding the advice of avoiding Dharamshala during the monsoon. He takes everything with a positive mindset, and he describes everything in an objective manner. Of course, he expresses his disappointments, but then he takes everything and all the difficulties that come across his way in a positive stride. So the spirit of a traveler is evident here. So Mystery next, he what he does is he describes views of Dharamshala. So he says that from his hotel room he could have a spectacular view of the Kangra Valley when he opened the curtains. Looking at the view, at the spectacular view, he begins to become a little reflective. He talks about the Dalai Lama leaving in Dharamshala since about the 1950s. The Dalai Lama, to elaborate a little on the figure, is the Dalai Lama is a respected religious figure of Buddhism. So he is like an incarnation of Buddha itself. So he's a very revered person. So what happened was that actually Mystery here alludes to the political and religious persecution of the Buddhists in Tibet. He says that the Dalai Lama who was living in Tibet was forced to flee due to the Chinese invasion of the place during the 1950s. And he sought refuge in India. He sought asylum in India, which was readily granted. And but then he was also followed by the other Tibetans or his followers who missed their leader. So Dharamshala, what happened in the 1950s was that Dharamshala witnessed waves and waves of refugees dropping in from Tibet, and each group of new refugee brought horrific stories about the Chinese persecution of the Tibetan people. The Chinese are reported to have wiped out monasteries and the whole history of Tibetan culture itself. And it was very necessary for Tibetans to seek asylum out of their country. And Dharamshala was one of those places which offered them that haven. After this mention, what Mystery does is he goes on to talk about the various titles of the Dalai Lama, which includes names, flowery titles like Precious, Protector, Gentle, Glory, Ocean of Wisdom, etc. And as a conscious traveler, what Mystery notices is that the landscape of Dharamshala felt very Tibetan, because he sees a very vibrant Tibetan colony in Dharamshala, and visitors from all over the world. That is, a lot of tourists were flocking into Dharamshala to visit the Tibetan colony and other Buddhist landmarks like the Namgyal Monastery, the Library of Tibetan Works and Archives, etc. At this point, with the mention of all these things, he again turns nostalgic, and he recalls his childhood fantasies regarding Dharamshala. So it is here where he first mentions about his uncle and aunt. He says that he felt strange that while they were living in Bombay, uh, a large part of the family lived in Bombay. So it was a little strange that one of their family members was living alone in Dharamshala, which was a faraway and exotic place for them. And he says that when he was young, his uncle would send photographs of the place in the sense of Dharamshala, to the relatives in Bombay. He would send photographs periodically. So the photos showed snow covered mountains and trails, and of uncle himself with his wife posing with his children with a snow clad background in winter wear, etc. So Mystery, who was from Bombay, a hot coastal city, would find it amazing that such a place even existed in India. So India, which was known to be a hot and torrid place. So Dharamshala felt somewhat foreign, somewhat exotic. So since those days, he harbored a desire to visit Dharamshala. So he was always willing to visit his uncle and aunt, but he says that for some reason or other, he could not make it. And then he moves on to description of his journey, the way he started. As I already mentioned, Mystery took a first class train from Bombay, which after 28 hours brought him to Punjab. And here he gives us a funny episode. So it was raining hard when he arrived in the station, and he was approached by a rickshaw puller. He thought that there would be a scarcity of transportation because of the heavy rains, and he readily agreed to the rickshaw puller to be taken to the bus station. But then he realized that there were three wheelers parked outside the station, and three wheelers they give better protection against the rain when compared to what he says the pitiful cycle rickshaw. And sure enough, he was completely drenched in a matter of seconds, even even after having his raincoat on. And not only his raincoat, not only what he was wearing, but even his bag, his luggage, everything inside it was completely soaked with water. So he details his disappointments, the disappointments he faced while traveling, the hardships, as I mentioned, the hardships of traveling. And but even after the disappointment with the rickshaw puller, he listened to the advice of the rickshaw puller, who said that it would be better to take a taxi to Dharamshala instead of taking a bus. And he says that he's glad that he listened to his advice, because when when he was riding on the taxi on his way to Dharamshala, he saw that there were buses lined up. They could not proceed because of the big rocks that had fallen due to the avalanches which happens during the monsoon season. Um, Mystery then moves on to describe the geographical features of Dharamshala. It is, he says, a colony of settlements spread out in the Dhauladhar range. He mentions the famous Ganj, which he notices on his way. He also takes note of places like the Kotwali Bazaar, which is the main commercial center of Dharamshala, with its shops restaurants and lodgings, the military cantonment, etc. He also gives a little recourse to British history regarding the place. He says that the British, when they were ruling India, they thought of making Dharamshala the summer capital. When the British were ruling India, they had deliberated upon the idea of making Dharamshala their summer capital, and they try to proceed with their plan of doing the same, because Dharamshala is relatively colder and it would be mild during the summer season. So that was the plan. But then the official records say that their plans were foiled by the Great Earthquake in 1905. It damaged the place completely, and they were forced to choose another place as the hill station, which was Shimla. But according to Mistry's uncle, he says that making Dharamshala the summer capital failed not because of the earthquake, but because the British official in charge of selecting Dharamshala suffered from dysentery on his way, and he died when he reached Dharamshala. Making Dharamshala the summer capital, the idea of making Dharamshala the summer capital was dropped promptly. The account, uncle's account, differs from the official account given of the choice of making Dharamshala the summer capital and why it failed ultimately. Now, Mistry says that he describes that he's finally able to visit his uncle and aunt. He's able to fulfill his original purpose of visiting Dharamshala. So he visits his uncle and aunt the next day. And they lived nearby, just 5 minutes walk away from the hotel where he was staying, which is Hotel Bhaksu. His uncle and aunt were evidently very sorry to see his poor condition, because his deplorable state, because he was all drenched and his belongings were all soaked, and he had to make do with very little. And they offered him access to use their bathroom, because they had a private pipeline which was still intact and it carried running water. So Mistry was pleasantly surprised, and when he asks how it came to be, how they came to have a private pipeline of their own, he is told history behind the saying that the Nauraj's store, which belongs to his uncle's family, was the only structure that survived the 1905 earthquake. And it served as a relief center during the devastation. And the Nauraji family, gave out food, clothing, and other necessities from their own store to the public. They did this until proper relief measures were sent out by the British government. So when things returned to normal, the then district commissioner of the place, as a sign of his gratitude, gifted the Nauraji family a mountain spring. So a private pipeline was thus built, which brought water from the spring directly to their home. And it was still in operation, surviving all the avalanches of all these years, which broke other pipelines. But theirs was still intact and running well. He notices that, like the locals, and see the family, Mistry's family, his uncle and aunt, they made their living by running a store. So he notices when he visits his uncle and aunt that there were many tourists from all around the world, and they were also hit by the water crisis during the monsoon, and they were stocking up on bottled mineral water, which they bought from his uncle's store. Thereafter, after this meeting, Mistry goes out with his uncle, who shows him around Dharamshala. He sees smiling monks, Tibetan monks, on the way, and Mistry is very impressed by their cheerful faces. He did not expect this from a people who had suffered so much. He says that they radiated something which can be called an inner well-being. Mistry says that he noticed. Mystery says that this is unexpected, the inner well-being thing, because as a people who are persecuted so badly, this was we can say radical. So Mystery again, as he walks with his uncle, he remarks on the local customs. He notices that people exchange namaskars with each other, whoever they meet along the way. So it is like greeting the God within you, a tradition or custom common to both Hindus and Buddhists. He talks about, he mentions the Buddhist monuments he sees along the way. He sees a chorten, which is a tall gold crown structure which was situated in the middle of a few buildings, and it was made in the memory of those who had suffered under the Chinese rule in Tibet. He sees monks simulating the holy walk by circling the structure while muttering prayers. He sees them roaming around the square, the market square, selling Tibetan handicraft. He could also see the Tibetan colony, which was further down, with the with which is easily recognizable with their faded prayer flag. And during this walk, Mystery could sense that although his uncle loved the Tibetan people, he admired the Tibetan people, he harbored a kind of a grudge against them, because the arrival of the Tibetan refugees had changed the landscape, the original landscape of Dharamshala as it used to be. And his uncle, Mystery's uncle, had in fact helped the Tibetan refugees to settle into the place comfortably by finding houses for them, by helping them build houses. But then a longing and a nostalgia of the place as it used to be before the arrival of the Tibetans must have been haunting him. Mystery also notices that the place, the Dharamshala that he is seeing now, does not completely resemble the Dharamshala in the photographs that his uncle had sent to him in Bombay, to his family in Bombay. He marks the changes, the various changes that has come to the place, other changes like especially caused by environmental degradation. This was because the mountain slopes were being deforested by people who were hungry for firewood, and this is naturally followed by soil erosion, landslides, and rockfalls. And Mr.'s uncle adds that the amount of snowfall has been lessening with every year. So as a conscious traveler, Mystery notices all these things and mentions it in this travelogue. So they continue to climb, they continue to walk, and they climb uphill and reach Tekchen Churling, which is the residence of the Dalai Lama. It is from this place, it is like his office, and from this place he gives the messages on the Mahayana Buddhism. Like, it is a sect, there are different sects of Buddhism, and the Tibetan Buddhists were from the Mahayana sect. Mystery and his uncle, they enter this place by removing their shoes. They did not come across the Dalai Lama there because he was in Ladakh at the moment to deliver the Kala Chakra, which is the Wheel of Time initiation. He looks at the high throne of the Dalai Lama, which was at one side of the main hall from where he preached. He gave his messages regularly, and behind the throne he sees a larger than life statue, a big statue of Buddha, in the lotus position, the typical Buddhist posture, which symbolized enlightenment and meditation and relaxation as well. So Mystery comments on the statue of Chenrezig, which he sees inside this compound. It had multiple heads and arms. So there is a story behind this. The multiple heads and arms symbolized compassion, according to the Buddhist story, because Chenrezig was someone who always thought about and wanted the happiness of all living beings, and this caused his head to burst into 1,000 heads, which represented the all-seeing nature of compassion, and his arms split into 1,000 arms, representing the omnipresence of help to be given to anyone in need. They also see, which is Mystery and his uncle, they see monks with their prayer beads doing the holy walk on their way out, and back at the store they discover to their dismay that the private water pipeline had been cut open by the desperate people seeking water. Next morning, Mystery realized with relief that electricity was back, but in and in spite of the bad stomach that he had. So this is something common. Many of the tourists, they suffer from bad stomach. It is because the different the next morning, Mystery realizes with relief that electricity was finally back, and in spite of the bad stomach he orders a breakfast of tea and toast. Having or getting a bad stomach is actually very common for travelers and tourists. This happens when you eat food that you're not used to. You don't have a set pattern of digestion, so getting a bad stomach is something common among travelers. So Mystery also gets that. So when he orders for his tea and toast, the desk clerk who takes his order like disappears after some time. He's nowhere to be seen after taking his order. So this irritates Mystery somewhat, and he goes out to look for the boy and starts to complain about the poor management. He is then informed by the watchman, the hotel watchman, that it was a Sunday. And because it was a Sunday, everybody in the town watches Ramayana in the morning, and they all get back to their respective works or jobs only when the show is over. He then talks about this popular epic series, which makes the desk clerk of the hotel disappear. He informs that when the Ramayana, one of the greatest Sanskrit epics of ancient India, was made into a TV serial, 60 million homes began tuning in every Sunday morning. And people who did not have TV sets of their own, they went to their friends' homes or the neighbors who had TVs of their own, and people and villagers, even strangers, would gather and garland the TV set and burn incense before the show started. So it was like a communal festival every Sunday morning. People would gather to watch this show. They would leave whatever they were doing and gather to watch the show. They do not want to miss out on this show. They do not want to miss out on even a single episode. It was that interesting to them. Various ads in newspapers. So various ads in newspapers would ask people to contact them only after the broadcast of Ramayana was over. Even oath-taking ceremonies of ministers were postponed if it clashed with the airing time of the show. So this is a humorous, we can say, anecdote on the part of Mystery. He wonders about the popularity of the show, and he says that the series, which originally had 78 episodes, the series actually had 78 episodes originally, but this number of episodes could not cover the entire epic within these limited episodes. So what happened was that protests and demonstrations erupted in different parts of the nation throughout India, where sweepers went on strike, and there were rallies in several cities. All of them demanded the addition of more episodes to do justice to the epic, the original story of the epic. So the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting conceded to this demand and allowed 26 more episodes to be added to satisfy the public demand. What was more distressing or disturbing for Mystery, though, was that people began to stalk the actor who played Rama in the series. They treated him as a real god, even bowing to him whenever they came across him. They touched his feet and asked for his blessing. Seeing this trend, the Congress party enlisted the actor god to campaign for their candidate with the hopes that they will win in the upcoming election. So this was heavily frowned upon, heavily criticized by the intellectuals of the country. So the Congress party, in short, they tried to manipulate the popularity of the series, and they used the actor who played in the campaigning process. The actor god would campaign for the candidate by telling the public or the masses that Rama's kingdom of Ayodhya would return if he's elected, and that they will be blessed if they do so, if they vote for him. But surprisingly, the Congress party met with a harsh defeat. So this was unexpected. Mystery wonders about the mass appeal, the huge popularity of the show. It amuses him as well. It intrigues him as well that this serial, the Ramayana, with very poor production and poor acting skills, it could even hold the attention of the viewers, and over such a long period of. And not only that, this show attracted a wide range of viewers, which included not only Hindus but also Sikhs, Muslims, Parsis, and Christians. So Mr. concludes that the ancient Sanskrit epic of Ramayana is a national heritage and it belongs to all Indians as it helps them overcome the barriers of caste, race, religion, etc. The TV show brought diverse communities together, even if it was for a short period of time. Every Sunday morning, say 1 hour, it brought people from different backgrounds together. So it had that attractive appeal. That is Mystery, did not expect to witness the power of the serial in a remote place like Dharamsala. Even the electricity workers who were on strike cooperated with the show. What they did was that they supplied electricity while the show was airing, but then cut off the supply again after the show ended. So this amuses him. This travel, Mystery, he realizes the power and the appeal of pop culture. This piece by Mystery, which is essentially a travel account, it familiarizes the readers with the remote mountain hamlet of Dharamshala. It's a place which is not easily accessible, which is easily evident in his strenuous 4 hours long taxi ride. The piece, the travelogue, also reads like a celebration of encounter with other cultures and differences in customs and traditions in a different place, which is, we can say, a basic trait of travel writing. It gives vital information to the reader regarding the place he is visiting and recounts his experiences honestly. Readers willing to visit Dharamshala will find good information regarding the place and will not repeat his mistake of visiting it during the monsoons. Readers also get to know and understand the lesson on history of the Tibetan settlement in Dharamshala. Mystery, as a seasoned writer and a seasoned traveler, he documents all the local quirks and traits of the places, which is, we can say, characteristic of a good travel writing. So this account by Mystery is a journey, a literal journey. And next we shall move on to Ondati's Angulimala, which is also about a journey, but that journey is not a literal journey in the sense of physical journey to a place or destination, but a journey of the spirit, a spiritual journey. So the story of Angulimala is actually very, we can say, pretty famous in the Buddhist tradition. And Ondati's Angulimala is a kind of retelling of the original legend or story of Angulimala. It must be said here that Angulimala has different versions, and each version vary from the other slightly. And to talk about the story, the original legend must be mentioned, which is the original legend which is popular in the Buddhist traditions. So as already mentioned, there are many folk versions of the story, and each version differs from the others slightly. And the story by Ondati is a retelling of the Pali version of the story, and it was called Angulimala. So Ondati is what he does is he follows this version of the story, and he does not deviate from it, the original style, the plot and incidents, and even dialogues closely. In the beginning, Ondati opens the story with a song sung by Angulimala. It is a kind of, we can say, autobiographical song which looks back on his life and the moral lessons that he has learned throughout his life. But the complete song is not revealed in the beginning. Readers will find the complete song only towards the end of the readers are introduced to the Buddha, who was teaching at a town called Savatthi, which is actually the birthplace of the protagonist of the story, which was also the capital of Kosala. In the story, the town of Savatthi is described as a great city with 100 gates and 100 guards. And on that day sets Angulimala's reputation in the beginning of the story as a fearful brigand. He is even compared with the king. It's almost as if he is at level with the king when the public is concerned, because the mass dread or the public fear towards this person was such that people went around saying that there were two rulers in the region, the king, the official king, and Angulimala. And the name Angulimala, which means a garland of fingers, is earned by the person because he used to rob and murder people mercilessly and cut off their fingers and wear them as a garland around his neck. And he does not even feel any sense of guilt for his actions. He does not have any qualms of conscience for doing so. And there was an infamous refrain going about Angulimala in the town, which declared that Angulimala was someone who could transform villages into non-villages, families into non-families. So Angulimala was a very dangerous person, in short, who could wipe out entire villages and entire families. So he had a good physical strength, and over the years he must have gained acquired good technique to kill people. And this refrain that Angulimala was someone who turned villages into non-villages and families into non-families is repeated throughout the story Boundate, and this is done because it served as a warning to people to avoid Angulimala as much as possible, because anyone who comes across Angulimala was sure to lose his or her life. The Buddha was then teaching and living in the town of Sabatthi when Angulimala, the fear and dread of Angulimala was at a peak. So what happened that one day the Buddha decided to travel through the countryside. The countryside is known as the place, is dreaded as the place where Angulimala used to roam about freely. And the local people who saw the Buddha going towards the countryside, they came to the Buddha and warned him and repeated the infamous refrain about the murderer, trying to stop him from going further. They said to him that Angulimala was so strong that he had even overpowered and killed people who were traveling in large groups, and even carried arms. The Buddha does not listen to them. He does not pay attention to the warnings and continues to go in the direction. He continues to walk in the direction of the countryside. And he goes alone, without any sense, without any hint of fear in him, and with only his begging bowl and his robe. When he reaches the forest, a few of the ancient hermits and recluses who lived in the caves nearby, they also are seen come out to warn him about the dangers of going ahead. They also repeated the same refrain regarding Angulimala, that he made villages into non-villages and families into non-families. And there was a mournful tone in the voices. So this must be because they were sad at the memory of the family that they had lost. Their families must have been mercilessly slaughtered by Angulimala. But the Buddha, he was unshaken by all these tales of the horrific crimes committed by Angulimala, and he continued to move relentlessly forward. When he reached the top of the hill, he was seen by Angulimala. The murderer found the sight of a lone man walking near his place very unusual and confusing, because it was rare for him to sight any person near his, we can say, his grounds, his area, because no one dared to approach him. Even a good number of people or a group of people carrying arms, they all avoided Angulimala as much as possible. They tried not to come in his. So this was an unusual sight of him, the sight of a lone man, an armless man walking in his area, coming towards him. Angulimala thinks that the monk who is coming towards him must be very foolish, since he was all alone and armless, and he decides to kill him at once, just as he kills other people. It was his, we can say, habit to target any person, whoever comes in his sight. So with the decision to kill him, he follows the monk, that is the Buddha, with his usual weapons, that is the sword, a bow and arrow. But what something interesting happens here. No matter how fast he walked or ran, he could not catch up with the monk. The monk always seemed to be ahead of him, always out of his reach, even though the monk was only walking and not even running. He did that for some time and tried to overtake the Buddha, but then he gave up. After he got tired after some time, and he gave up, and he cried out, becoming curious, he cried out, to the monk. He asked the Buddha to stop and stand still and said that he wanted to have a talk with. The Buddha then turned and replied that he was in fact standing still. It was only Angulimala who was not standing still, as he was restless. Angulimala did not get what the monk said. Monk, in the sense the Buddha. He did not get what the Buddha meant and asked him to explain what he just said to him. The Buddha said, he answered that he said that he was standing still because he had given up using violence and force against living beings, unlike Angulimala, who always chased people and animals to kill them with the intention of killing them. He also says that because Angulimala was moving at such a fast in life, always looking about to kill someone, he would die far sooner than everyone else as a sort of punishment. So at these words, Ondatya says that Angulimala is pierced, that he stood still. In Ondaty's, what happens is that at last a speaker of truth had entered his forest. This was a great and sudden journey, surrounded by silence, like a stone falling and falling into a well. So Ondatya says that this encounter caused Angulimala to have an enlightenment, and this enlightenment was like a great and a sudden journey. So this journey is not a physical journey but a spiritual journey, so moving from one place to another in your spirit. So Angulimala, after his enlightenment, when he sees the error of his ways, he repents, and he repents immediately, and he says that he will bury his evil. He goes on to bury his usual weapons of violence, that is his sword, his bow and arrow. Then he approaches the Buddha, bows to him, touches his feet, and says that he would like to become his disciple. So Buddha in reply says that he was already a monk. By addressing, does not say that Buddha, what he does is that when Angulimala expresses his desire to become Buddha's disciple, the Holy One says that he is already a monk. He has become a monk after his spiritual journey, his transformation or his enlightenment. And the Buddha addresses Angulimala as monk and asks him to follow. So the fearsome bandit and the serial killer thus becomes a monk with Buddha's teaching. So the next parts of the story, they describe how the two of them journeyed to the edge of the town of Savatthi, where Angulimala bid farewell to the Buddha, and they parted their ways. And says that, and Ondatya says that Angulimala, what he does after this farewell is that he takes the path of Dhamma, or the truth. So he returns to the forest and lives alone there with the monk's begging bowl and old robes. He would sometimes come out of the forest, he would come to the city to beg, and he was not recognized by the people because of his begging bowl and his old robes. He would, when he would come to the city, he began to become aware of the sufferings and sorrows and the various miseries of the people all around. For the first time, he begins to see the poor and the homeless, and the people in pain and fear, and people injured in wars and other atrocities. And for the first time, he finds himself feeling sympathy for them. But one time what happened was that when he entered the city, he was recognized. Unfortunately, he was recognized by a few people. So this led to the townspeople to gather around him. They set out to punish the former murderer by hurling rocks and sharp metals and broken pottery, whatever they could get their hands to, at him. They beat him and smashed his begging bowl. They even tore his robes and broke his fingers. So it was like an eye for an eye moment. See, they took revenge. The townspeople, with the pent-up anger towards the murderer, they took revenge by breaking his fingers, because it was fingers that he used to collect, that Angulimala used to collect as a murderer. Angulimala faints after this atrocity, and the people threw him where they usually throw the dead bodies of birds and animals. They piled the bodies of the dead birds and animals upon him, in an attempt to bury him under them and left him lying there. When Angulimala finally regained consciousness after a few hours, in the dead of the night, when no one was about, he walked away unnoticed. That is, he escaped, in short, and went towards the forest where he saw the Buddha standing. He hesitantly walks towards the Buddha in spite of the pain and his bleeding wounds and his deep embarrassment regarding his situation. But the Buddha, who seemed to know all about what had happened to him, does not look shocked at his condition and gives him a cheerful smile. And instead of reassuring Angulimala with the comforting words, the Buddha, what he does is that he asks Angulimala to endure the insults and the hatred that he had just received. He says to Angulimala that he had received the punishment of centuries in hell for all the sins he had committed on earth in the form of the mob attack. This was a kind of atonement for all his crimes of looting people, of mercilessly murdering countless innocent people, and that this atrocity was something necessary, vital for him, because it allowed him to experience hell on earth for the sake of his ultimate freedom or nirvana. The Buddha then takes him to a river nearby where he bathes the reformed monk and cleans his wounds and gives him his own robes and begging bowl. With this second meeting with the Holy One and the second lesson, Angulimala finally comes to understand the true meaning of freedom and its joys. After the Buddha left, he sings the song of spiritual enlightenment and gratitude, which was referred to in the beginning of the story. The end of the story, the complete version of the story is it is at the end of the story where we find the complete version of the song, which was introduced in the beginning. And these verses, they basically say that Angulimala was someone who was never able to control his violent temper until his fateful encounter with the Buddha. Angulimala was known and addressed by various titles such as the thief, the violent one, the great flood, etc. And people continually lived in fear of the murderer. But the Buddha tamed him by enlightening him and prevented 1,000 evil rebirths for the former murderer. So non-violence and transformation are some of the crucial teachings of this story. And Angulimala's, through his legend, we come to know about the transformational power, and we come to know about the symbolic importance of the figure itself for the Buddhists. As already mentioned, Angulimala's spiritual awakening, his spiritual journey and enlightenment, and the subsequent transformation, which are the key events of the story, give hope of change to immoral humanity trapped in a cycle of bad deeds. It also sheds light on the virtues of a true and noble teacher like the Buddha, and this story has become an example for people seeking spiritual liberation. From a fierce murderer to a humble monk, the story of Angulimala's change and evolution has been inspiring people into believing that spiritual enlightenment and freedom are indeed attainable for everyone. Thank you.